In 1880s England, a destitute gentleman inherits a once grand but now ruined estate, mocked by neighbours and former friends who sneer, "You lost everything." As he and his young son wander the crumbling corridors, the boy discovers a concealed panel leading to a hidden vault. Inside lies a $4 million fortune in gold and documents revealing a scandal that could shake high society. What began as disgrace becomes redemption, turning the family's fall from grace into a sensational Victorian triumph. But when the truth behind that hidden fortune surfaces, will it save them or destroy what little remains of their name? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of decay through the broken windows of Thornhill Manor, a fitting metaphor for the life of its current master. Edward Thornhill stood in what had once been the grand entrance hall, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, studying the one piece of his former life he could not bring himself to sell. The family portrait hung crooked on the wall, its gilded frame tarnished, the canvas water-damaged from a leak in the roof 3 winters past. In the painting, his grandfather stood proud in his evening dress, his father beside him as a young man, and the manor rising behind them in all its glory. 40 rooms, manicured gardens, stables that housed a dozen horses. That world seemed as distant now as ancient Rome. Edward was 52 years old, though the mirror suggested he carried the weight of 70. His dark hair had gone silver at the temples, deep lines etched around eyes that had once sparkled with the confidence of a Cambridge-educated gentleman. His clothes, though clean and pressed with careful dignity, were threadbare at the cuffs. He wore them as he wore his circumstances, with a quiet resignation that bordered on grace. "Father." The voice belonged to Thomas, his 11-year-old son, who appeared in the doorway, carrying an armful of kindling. The boy had his mother's gentle features and Edward's thoughtful eyes. "Mrs. Dawson says the fire in the kitchen is enough for today. We shouldn't waste the wood." Edward turned, managing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Quite right. We must be practical." He watched as Thomas set the kindling in the brass bucket by the cold fireplace. Once that fireplace had roared through every winter evening, warming the hall for guests who arrived in carriages. Now they heated only 3 rooms, the kitchen and 2 bedrooms on the 2nd floor. The rest of the manor stood empty, a mausoleum to better days. It had been 4 years since Margaret's death. 4 years since the consumption had taken her, leaving Edward alone to raise their son and manage an estate already drowning in debt. She had been the daughter of a country vicar, bringing no fortune to their marriage, but she had brought something far more valuable. She had brought light. Without her, the manor felt darker even on the sunniest days. The financial collapse had not been sudden. It had crept upon them like fog, rolling across the Yorkshire moors. Edward's father had died when Edward was 30, leaving him the estate and what he believed to be a comfortable inheritance. What he hadn't known was that his younger brother Henry had been gambling away family money for years, forging Edward's signature on loans their father had never authorized. By the time Edward discovered the truth, Henry had fled to America and the creditors were circling. Edward had tried to salvage what he could. He sold the horses first, then the carriages. The artwork went next, piece by piece, to collectors in London who paid a fraction of their worth. The wine cellar, the silver, the fine china. Even Margaret's jewellery, though she had insisted they keep it for Thomas's future. He sold it anyway, in the dark months after her death, when he could barely afford coal for the fire. The village of Greystone, which had once looked upon the Thornhills with respect bordering on reverence, now whispered behind gloved hands. Edward had caught fragments of their gossip at the market. Such a fall. Pride before destruction. Those Thornhill boys always were reckless. They lumped him together with Henry as if Edward had been complicit in his own ruin. The worst were his former friends. Lord Blackwood, whose estate bordered his own, had been a schoolmate at Cambridge. They had hunted together, shared brandy in the library, discussed literature and politics late into the night. Now, when their paths crossed, Blackwood looked through him as if he were made of glass. Lady Pemberton, who had once begged Margaret for her recipes and fashion advice, now crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Edward approaching. Only a handful remained loyal. Mrs. Dawson, their housekeeper, had stayed on despite Edward's inability to pay her more than room and board. She was 63, with silver hair she wore in a practical bun, and hands that had scrubbed these floors for 40 years. "I'll not abandon this house," she had told him firmly when he suggested she seek employment elsewhere. "Your father hired me when I had nothing. I'll stay until they carry me out." Mr. Pettigrew, the village solicitor, still treated Edward with respect. He managed what little remained of the estate's legal affairs, often waiving his fees. Pettigrew was a thin man, with kind eyes, who had known Edward since boyhood. He had been the one to untangle the mess Henry left behind, working through ledgers and loan documents with patient thoroughness. The news had been worse each time they met. The manor itself told the story of decline in 1,000 small details. The grand ballroom, where Edward's parents had hosted elaborate parties, now stood empty. The parquet floor, once polished to a mirror shine, was scarred and dusty. Mice had made nests in the corners. The chandelier, too large and valuable to transport easily, remained, though half its crystals were missing. Sold individually to collectors who didn't ask questions, the library had been Edward's sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with first editions and leather-bound volumes collected over 3 generations. He had sold them all, except the ones he used to teach Thomas. Mathematics, history, Latin, literature. Edward had been a scholar once, had dreamed of becoming a professor before duty to the estate had called him home. Now he poured that knowledge into his son, determined that Thomas would have the education of a gentleman, even if they lived like paupers. The conservatory, his mother's pride, was a skeleton of iron and shattered glass. The exotic plants had died within months of her passing, and Edward lacked the funds to repair the structure. Vines crept through the broken panes, reclaiming the space for wildness. Sometimes Edward stood there at sunset, remembering his mother in her gardening apron, explaining the Latin names of orchids to a young boy who would rather be climbing trees. Thomas had adapted to poverty better than Edward had any right to expect. The boy never complained about their meager meals, never asked for the toys and treats other children received. He wore his shabby clothes without shame and studied his lessons with fierce concentration. At night, Edward sometimes heard him crying softly in his room, and it broke his heart in ways the financial ruin never could. They took their meals in the kitchen now, at the scarred wooden table where servants had once eaten. Mrs. Dawson prepared simple fare from what the garden and their few remaining chickens provided. Porridge for breakfast, vegetable soup for supper, bread that was sometimes a day old. Edward had taught himself not to remember the elaborate dinners his mother had orchestrated, the roasted meats and delicate pastries, the wines from France and Italy. The village itself had prospered, while the Thornhills declined. Greystone had grown with the railroad's arrival, new shops opening along the high street, new families moving into homes built on what had once been Thornhill land. Edward had been forced to sell parcels piece by piece, watching his family's holdings shrink like a dying man losing weight. Lord Blackwood had purchased most of it, adding to his already considerable holdings. Edward suspected Blackwood enjoyed the reversal of fortune, though the man was too well bred to say so openly. On Sundays, Edward and Thomas attended church, sitting in the Thornhill family pew that his ancestors had occupied for 200 years. The wood was carved with their coat of arms, a thorn bush and a hill beneath 3 stars. Thomas traced the carving with his finger during sermons, a habit that reminded Edward painfully of Margaret. She had done the same thing, her mind wandering during the vicar's longer theological digressions. The other families filled the church in their fine clothes, the rustle of silk and the gleam of jewellery, a reminder of what Edward had lost. The Ashworths, the Pembertons, the Blackwoods, all dressed as if they were attending court rather than a village church. Edward wore the same suit every week, brushed and mended so many times the fabric was nearly transparent at the elbows. Thomas's clothes were let out as far as they could go, the hems revealing where they had been lengthened repeatedly. Yet Edward insisted on certain standards. They arrived punctually. They sat with straight backs. They sang the hymns in clear voices. If the village wanted to see the Thornhills broken, they would be disappointed. Edward might be poor, but he refused to be pathetic. In the evenings, after Thomas had gone to bed, Edward walked the corridors of the manor alone. It was his habit, his meditation, his penance. He moved through rooms filled with ghosts, remembering parties and laughter, his father's stern voice discussing estate business, his mother's gentle singing as she arranged flowers, Margaret reading by the window, sunlight in her hair. The east wing was the most dangerous part of these nocturnal wanderings. The roof had partially collapsed 2 winters ago, and rain had done its work on the floors and walls. Edward avoided it mostly, but sometimes he stood at the entrance, peering down the dark corridor, remembering when these rooms had been full of life. His grandparents had lived in the east wing, preferring its morning light and view of the gardens. His grandfather had been a private man, spending hours in his study there, managing the estate with meticulous attention to detail. It was his grandfather who had built the family fortune in the first place. Before him, the Thornhills had been comfortable but not wealthy. Grandfather had invested wisely in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, in textile mills and railway shares, in shipping companies and coal mines. He had survived the banking crisis of 1825, when many of his peers had been ruined. Edward's father had often spoken of his own father's cunning, his ability to sense which way the financial winds were blowing. Yet for all his business acumen, grandfather had been an eccentric man. Edward remembered him vaguely from childhood, a tall figure with penetrating eyes who spoke rarely but always with purpose. He had died when Edward was 8, leaving the estate to Edward's father with strict instructions in his will. Edward's father had followed those instructions religiously, though he never spoke of their specific nature. Some family mystery, Edward had assumed, some peculiarity of the old man's character. It had seemed unimportant at the time. Now, standing in the ruined manor, Edward wondered what his grandfather would think of his grandson's failure. Would he be disappointed, angry, or would he understand that some tides are too strong to swim against, some debts too deep to climb out of? Thomas found him there one evening, standing at the entrance to the east wing with a candle in his hand. The boy approached quietly, the way Margaret used to, and slipped his small hand into Edward's larger one. "You're thinking about Mother," Thomas said. "It was not a question. I am always thinking about your mother," Edward replied. "But tonight I was thinking about my grandfather. I wish I'd known him better. Perhaps he would have taught me how to manage money more wisely. Mrs. Dawson says Uncle Henry is the one who should feel ashamed, not you." Edward smiled despite himself. Mrs. Dawson had strong opinions about Henry and expressed them with a bluntness that would have scandalized Margaret. "Mrs. Dawson is very kind, but I am the elder brother. I should have been more watchful. You trusted him." Mother always said that trust is not a weakness. The boy's simple wisdom, so like his mother's, threatened to undo Edward's composure. He squeezed Thomas's hand gently. "Your mother was the wisest person I ever knew. Come, it's past your bedtime. Tomorrow we continue with Caesar's Gallic Wars." They walked back through the corridors together, the candle casting their shadows long against the walls. In Thomas's room, a small space under the eaves that had once housed a maid, Edward tucked the blankets around his son. The room was cold, despite the small fire Mrs. Dawson had lit earlier. Edward made a mental note to check the kindling supply. "Father," Thomas said, as Edward was turning to leave, "do you think things will ever be better?" Edward paused at the doorway. He could offer false hope, paint pictures of miraculous rescues that would never come. Or he could tell the truth in a way an 11-year-old could bear. "I think," he said carefully, "that we have each other and we have our health and we have our dignity. Those are things worth more than money. As for tomorrow, we will face it when it comes, as we have faced every day since your mother left us. With courage and with grace." Thomas nodded, satisfied with this answer in the way only a child can be. "Good night, Father." "I love you. I love you too, son. More than you know." Edward retreated to his own room, smaller than the master bedroom he had once shared with Margaret. That room held too many memories. He undressed slowly, folding his clothes with care, and climbed into bed. Sleep came reluctantly these days, and when it did, it brought dreams of better times that made waking a fresh grief. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the broken conservatory and the gaps in the east wing roof. Somewhere in the house, a shutter banged rhythmically. Edward had learned to ignore such sounds. The manor was falling apart around them, and he lacked the means to stop it. All he could do was hold on, keep Thomas safe and educated, and hope that somehow they would survive. The next morning brought a rare visitor. Miss Emily Hartley arrived at 9:30, walking up the overgrown drive with a basket over her arm. She was the village schoolteacher, a widow of 35 with intelligent eyes and a practical manner. Edward had met her at church functions, where she always treated him with the same courtesy she had shown before his fall from grace. Mrs. Dawson showed her into the kitchen, the only room Edward felt comfortable receiving guests anymore. He rose from the table where he had been reviewing Thomas's mathematics work, suddenly conscious of his worn jacket and the patches on his trousers. "Miss Hartley, this is unexpected. Mr. Thornhill." She set her basket on the table. "I hope I'm not intruding. I brought some preserves from my garden. Mrs. Peterson's plum trees were particularly generous this year, and she shared the bounty with several of us." Edward recognized the kindness for what it was. Charity disguised as neighborly generosity. His pride wanted to refuse, but Thomas's thin frame and Mrs. Dawson's grateful expression stopped him. "That's very thoughtful. Please sit." She took the offered chair, arranging her sensible brown skirts. "I also came to speak with you about Thomas. He's been absent from school for 3 months now." Edward felt heat rise to his face. "I've been teaching him myself. His education has not been neglected. I don't doubt that for a moment. A Cambridge man is more than qualified." Miss Hartley's tone was gentle. "But I wonder if you've considered what Thomas might be missing beyond academics. The companionship of other children, the social education that comes from the schoolroom." "The other children mock him," Edward said quietly. "They repeat their parents' gossip. I will not subject my son to that humiliation." Miss Hartley nodded slowly. "Some do, yes. Children can be cruel, but not all of them, Mr. Thornhill. Young William Peterson asked about Thomas just yesterday. They were friends before, and Sarah Fletcher still speaks warmly of him." She paused. "Isolation can be its own kind of cruelty, even when born of love." The words struck deeper than Edward wanted to admit. He had kept Thomas close partly to protect him, but also for his own sake. The boy was all he had left of Margaret, all he had left of hope. The thought of sending him back into a world that might hurt him was unbearable. "I will consider it," Edward said finally. It was the most he could offer. Miss Hartley seemed to understand. She rose but hesitated at the door. "Mr. Thornhill, may I speak plainly? I suspect you're going to regardless." A small smile touched her lips. "You are respected more than you know. Not by the Blackwoods or the Pembertons, perhaps, but by people who matter. The shopkeepers, the farmers, the working families. They remember your father's fairness, your grandfather's generosity in hard times. They see you maintaining your dignity through circumstances that would break lesser men. That counts for something." After she left, Edward stood at the kitchen window, watching her retreating figure. Mrs. Dawson came to stand beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. "She's a good woman, that one," the housekeeper said. "Lost her husband to fever 5 years ago. Knows something about carrying on when life knocks you down. She's wasted her morning on charity calls." Charity. That woman makes her own way in the world, same as us. What she brought was kindness, which is different altogether. Mrs. Dawson fixed him with a stern look. "And she's right about the boy. He needs friends his own age. You can't be everything to him, Mr. Edward, no matter how hard you try." Edward knew she was right, just as he knew Miss Hartley had been right. But knowing something and accepting it were different matters entirely. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his lesson books under his arm, and the conversation ended. They spent the morning on Latin declensions and British history, Edward's voice steady as he guided his son through conjugations and the complex politics of the Tudor court. But his mind kept returning to Miss Hartley's words. He had been so focused on survival, on maintaining some shred of dignity in the face of ruin, that he had not considered what Thomas might be losing beyond material comfort, friends, laughter, the rough and tumble of boyhood that Edward himself had enjoyed at that age. He had thought he was protecting his son. Perhaps he had been imprisoning him instead. That afternoon, he made a decision. "Thomas, tomorrow you will return to school." The boy looked up from his book, surprise evident on his young face. "Are you certain, Father?" "Miss Hartley visited this morning. She made some excellent points about your education." Edward kept his voice firm, though doubt gnawed at him. "I'm not afraid of the other boys," Thomas said, though his eyes betrayed the lie. "I know you're not, but you deserve the chance to be around children your own age, to have friends. Your mother would have wanted that. For you." The mention of Margaret settled the matter. Thomas nodded, accepting the decision with the quiet maturity that was both admirable and heartbreaking in one so young. Edward wondered when his son had lost the ability to simply be a child, to protest and argue and demand his own way. Poverty had aged them both. That evening, as the sun set through the broken windows of the conservatory, Edward stood once more before the damaged family portrait. His grandfather stared out from the canvas with those penetrating eyes, and Edward found himself speaking aloud to the painted figure. "I don't know what you would have done in my place. You survived when others failed. You built something lasting, or so we thought. Henry destroyed in a few years what took you a lifetime to create. And I was too blind to see it happening." He paused, studying the painted face. "I hope wherever you are, you understand that I tried. I'm still trying. For Thomas, if for nothing else." The portrait offered no answers, only that stern, painted gaze that seemed to hold secrets Edward would never know. His grandfather had been a man of mysteries, of private strategies and plans he shared with no one. Edward's father had spoken of sealed letters, instructions to be opened only under certain circumstances. But if such documents existed, Edward had never found them. Perhaps they had been destroyed, or perhaps they had never existed at all, simply family legend embellished over time. Mrs. Dawson called him to supper, breaking his reverie. They ate in the kitchen as always, a simple stew made from vegetables, and a bit of rabbit Mrs. Dawson had traded for with a farmer. The bread was fresh, still warm from the oven. It was humble fare, but it was hot and filling, and Edward offered a quiet prayer of thanks before they ate. "Miss Hartley seems very kind," Thomas ventured as they ate. "She is," Edward agreed. "Your mother would have liked her. Do you like her, Father?" Edward looked up sharply, but saw only innocent curiosity in his son's face. "I respect her very much. She's a woman of considerable intelligence and character. Mother used to say that respect was the foundation of all good relationships. Your mother was wise about many things." Edward changed the subject, uncomfortable with where this conversation might lead. He was not ready to consider such matters, was not sure he ever would be. Margaret had been everything to him. The thought of another woman seemed like betrayal, even 4 years after her death. After supper, Edward helped Thomas prepare for his return to school, laying out his clothes, checking his slate and primers. The boy's excitement was palpable, despite his earlier anxiety. Children were resilient in ways adults forgot to be, able to hope when hope seemed foolish. Alone in his room later, Edward opened the small drawer where he kept Margaret's letters. He selected one at random, unfolding the familiar handwriting. She had written it during their courtship, when he was visiting London on estate business, and she remained in the countryside with her father. "My dearest Edward," it began, "the roses are blooming in Father's garden, and I think of how you admired them when you visited last month. I've pressed one between these pages for you, so you might carry a bit of home with you to the city. I count the days until your return, though I am careful not to let father see my impatience. He already suspects I am hopelessly in love with you, and I would not give him the satisfaction of being right, though of course he is." Edward smiled despite the ache in his chest. She had been so full of life, so determined to find joy in small things. Even when illness took her strength, she maintained that quality, making him promise not to let grief consume him, to care for Thomas, to find happiness again somehow. He had kept 2 of those promises. The third seemed beyond his capability. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the manor, and somewhere deep in the east wing, something creaked and groaned. Edward made a mental note to check the damage in the morning, though he knew he could do nothing to repair it. The manor was dying around them, slowly surrendering to time and weather and neglect. He could only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. He returned Margaret's letter to the drawer and prepared for bed. Another day survived, another night to face. Tomorrow Thomas would return to school, and Edward would continue his solitary battle against ruin. It was not the life he had imagined, but it was the life he had, and he would face it as he faced everything else. With whatever dignity he could muster, the morning began like any other, with Edward rising before dawn to light the kitchen fire before Mrs. Dawson arrived. The autumn air had turned sharp overnight, promising an early winter. He stood at the window watching frost glitter on the overgrown lawn, thinking about the cost of coal and whether they could afford enough to heat even their 3 rooms through the coming months. Thomas appeared at 7, dressed in his school clothes, nervous energy radiating from him. Edward had mended the boy's jacket the night before, disguising the worn patches as best he could. They ate breakfast in near silence, both caught in their own thoughts, until a knock at the kitchen door startled them. Mrs. Dawson answered it, returning with a puzzled expression. "There's a gentleman here to see you, Mr. Edward. Says his name is Grimsby. He has an official look about him." Edward's stomach tightened. Official visits never brought good news. He rose, smoothing his jacket, and followed Mrs. Dawson to the front entrance. A man waited there, middle-aged and officious, carrying a leather document case. His clothes marked him as a clerk or solicitor, respectable but not prosperous. "Mr. Edward Thornhill?" the man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I am he. My name is Reginald Grimsby. I represent Hartwick & Sons, banking establishment of London. I'm here on behalf of your creditors regarding the outstanding debts on this property." He withdrew a document from his case. "I'm afraid I must serve you with formal notice of eviction." The words seemed to come from a great distance. Edward heard them, understood them, but could not quite connect them to reality. He had known this day would come eventually, had braced himself for it, yet the actual arrival still struck with the force of a physical blow. "I see," he managed. "May I examine the document?" Grimsby handed it over with what might have been sympathy in his eyes. Edward scanned the legal language, the formal pronouncements, the date that stood out in stark black ink. 60 days. They had 60 days to vacate Thornhill Manor. "This is all quite proper, I'm sure," Edward said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Thank you for making the journey to deliver it in person. I'm sorry, Mr. Thornhill. Truly I am. These are never pleasant matters." Grimsby hesitated. "The property will be auctioned to settle the debts. The bank has already received several inquiries from interested parties." "I'm certain they have." Edward folded the document carefully. "Good day, Mr. Grimsby." He closed the door on the man's apologetic expression and stood in the entrance hall, staring at the paper in his hands. 60 days. 2 months. Then they would lose everything, the manor, the land, the last physical connection to his family's history. He and Thomas would be homeless, penniless, dependent on the charity of others or the workhouse. Behind him, he heard a small sound. He turned to find Thomas standing in the hallway, his face pale, his schoolbooks clutched forgotten in his hands. The boy had heard everything. "Father?" Thomas's voice was small, frightened in a way Edward had not heard since Margaret's death. Edward forced himself to move, to cross the distance between them and kneel before his son. "It's going to be all right. We'll find a way. But where will we go? What will we do?" "I don't know yet. But we have 60 days to make a plan. That's more time than many people have." Edward tried to inject confidence he did not feel into his words. "Remember what your mother always said. We are Thornhills. We endure." Thomas nodded, but tears spilled down his cheeks. Edward pulled him close, holding tight as the boy wept against his shoulder. Over Thomas's head, Edward stared at the damaged family portrait on the wall. His grandfather's painted eyes seemed to accuse him. "You failed. You lost everything we built." Mrs. Dawson appeared, took in the scene with one comprehensive glance, and quietly withdrew. Edward held his son until the tears subsided, then sent him upstairs to wash his face. School could wait another day. This morning had already taught them more about life's cruelties than any classroom lesson. Alone again, Edward read through the eviction notice more carefully. The language was precise and unforgiving. The debts itemized, the legal justifications outlined, the consequences made clear. The manor would be sold at auction on the 10th of December. Any proceeds beyond the debt would be returned to Edward, though both he and the bank knew there would be none. He walked to his small study, a cramped room off the kitchen that had once been a pantry. Here he kept what remained of the estate records, the ledgers that documented their decline year by year. He pulled out Margaret's small wooden box, the one containing her few remaining personal items. Inside was her wedding ring, which he had not been able to bring himself to sell, and the miniature portrait, painted on their first anniversary. He touched the delicate frame with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the painted face. "I promised to take care of Thomas, to preserve something for him. I've failed at both." The morning stretched on, each minute heavy with dread. Thomas did not come downstairs, and Edward did not call for him. Mrs. Dawson moved quietly through her tasks, respecting their need for space and silence. The fire she built in the kitchen seemed inadequate against the cold that had settled into Edward's bones. Near noon, another visitor arrived. Edward saw the carriage through the window, recognized the Blackwood crest on its door. His jaw tightened. Lord Blackwood himself come to gloat or to make some final, humiliating offer. Lord Richard Blackwood entered with the confidence of a man who had never known real adversity. He was 50, well-dressed, his features showing the softness of good living. He and Edward had been friends once, had studied together at Cambridge, had debated philosophy and politics long into the night. Now there was nothing in Blackwood's eyes but calculation. "Edward, I heard about the eviction notice." "Terrible business." Blackwood's sympathy rang hollow. "I wanted to speak with you before the auction. I'm prepared to make an offer for the property, a private sale that would spare you the humiliation of a public auction." "How kind of you," Edward said dryly. "And this offer, I assume it would barely cover the debts." "Business is business, old friend. The property is in dreadful condition. I would be taking on significant repair costs." Blackwood's smile did not reach his eyes. "But I'm willing to make allowances for our past friendship. £500 above the debt settlement. Enough to give you and the boy a fresh start somewhere else." Edward felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. £500 for a property that in good condition would be worth 20 times that amount. Blackwood was offering charity disguised as business, condescension wrapped in false kindness. "And if I refuse, then the property goes to auction, where I'll likely acquire it anyway, for even less. But you'll have gone through the public spectacle, and you'll receive nothing." Blackwood adjusted his gloves. "I'm trying to help you, Edward." "Pride won't put food on your table. Pride is all I have left." Edward's voice was quiet but firm. "I will not sell my family's home to you for a pittance. I would rather see it burned to the ground." Blackwood's expression hardened. "You're a fool. You always were too sentimental. Your father understood business. Your grandfather certainly did. But you, Edward, you're weak. Just like that brother of yours. The Thornhill line has gone soft. Get out of my house. It won't be your house much longer." Blackwood turned toward the door, then paused. "I'll see you at the auction, Edward." To try to maintain some dignity when the hammer falls. After Blackwood left, Edward stood trembling with anger and impotence. The man was right about one thing. Pride would not feed Thomas. It would not keep them warm through winter. Yet to accept Blackwood's offer felt like the final surrender, the last betrayal of everything his family had been. He found Thomas in his room, sitting on the narrow bed, staring at nothing. Edward sat beside him, the mattress creaking under their combined weight. Was that Lord Blackwood? Thomas asked. Yes. What did he want? To buy the manor before the auction. For far less than it's worth. Did you sell it to him? No, I will not give him the satisfaction. Edward put his arm around his son's thin shoulders. We will face the auction with our heads high. Whatever comes after, we'll face that too. Together. Thomas leaned against him, and they sat in silence as afternoon light faded from the small window. Somewhere in the manor a door slammed in the wind. The sound echoed through empty rooms, a reminder of all that was already lost, and all that soon would be. 3 days passed, in a strange fog of activity and paralysis. Edward moved through the manor, cataloguing everything that remained, creating lists of items they might sell before the auction. A few pieces of furniture, some books he had kept for sentimental reasons, Margaret's china tea set. It would bring almost nothing, but almost nothing was better than nothing at all. Thomas had returned to school, facing the whispers and sidelong glances with a stoicism that made Edward's heart ache. Miss Hartley had sent a note expressing her sympathy and offering any assistance within her power. Edward had not responded. What could she do? What could anyone do? On the 4th day, Edward climbed to the attic, seeking anything of value they might have overlooked. The space was dark and cramped, filled with trunks and boxes accumulated over generations. Dust motes danced in the thin light from the single window. He moved methodically through the debris of family history, finding little of monetary worth, but much that stirred memory. A wooden sword he and Henry had played with as boys. His mother's hat boxes, still fragrant with lavender. His father's old ledgers, documenting decades of careful estate management that Henry had undone in a few reckless years. And then, in a corner beneath a moth-eaten blanket, he found a leather-bound trunk he did not recognize. The trunk was locked, but the mechanism was old and yielded easily to pressure. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, he found a book. Not a ledger, but a personal diary. Its cover embossed with the initials M.T. Margaret Thornhill. Edward's hands shook as he opened it. Margaret's handwriting flowed across the pages, entries dating back to the early years of their marriage. He had not known she kept a diary. She had been private about some things, and he had respected that privacy. Now, alone in the attic with autumn light fading, he began to read. Most entries were mundane, charming snapshots of daily life. Her observations about running the household, her plans for the garden, her thoughts about Thomas as a baby. Edward smiled through tears, hearing her voice in every word. But as he turned the pages, moving through the years, certain entries began to catch his attention. Edward's father is a difficult man to know, she had written in 1875. He is kind in his way, but there are depths to him he reveals to no one, not even his son. Today, I overheard him speaking with Mr. Pettigrew about contingencies and provisions for dark days. When I asked Edward about it, he said his father has always been cautious, perhaps excessively so. But I wonder if there is more to it than simple caution. Edward sat back, processing this. His father had been careful, yes, but Margaret had sensed something beyond mere prudence. He continued reading, searching for more references. 3 pages later, the east wing remains closed much of the time. Edward's father spends hours there when he visits, though he claims to be merely inspecting for repairs. I asked Mrs. Dawson if she knew what occupied him, but she only said that old Mr. Thornhill was the same way, secretive about certain things. It seems to be a family trait, this privacy about matters they deem important. Edward's pulse quickened. The east wing. His grandfather's territory, then his father's. The part of the manor now most damaged, most dangerous to enter. Why had they spent so much time there? What had they been doing? He flipped forward, looking for more clues. Near the end of the diary, in an entry dated just months before Margaret's illness, he found what he was looking for. Edward's father pulled me aside today after Sunday dinner. He looked troubled, older than I had seen him. He spoke of insurance, of the Thornhill legacy, of ensuring Thomas would always have something to fall back upon should disaster strike. I asked him what he meant, but he only said that some secrets must be kept even from those we love most. The East Wing holds more than memories, he told me. If ever the family faces true ruin, look carefully at what my father built. He made me promise not to speak of it to Edward, said it would only burden him unnecessarily. I gave my word, though I confess I do not understand what he meant. Edward read the passage 3 times, his mind racing. His father had died 2 years after this conversation, his grandfather decades before that. Neither had explicitly told him about any hidden provisions, any insurance against catastrophe. Yet Margaret's words suggested they had planned something, prepared for exactly the circumstances Edward now faced. Look carefully at what my father built. Not Edward's father, but his grandfather. The man who had survived the banking crisis of 1825, who had built the family fortune, who had spent so much time in the East Wing. Edward descended from the attic, with the diary clutched in his hands, his mind churning with possibilities. He found Thomas in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Dawson prepare vegetables for supper. The boy looked up as Edward entered, immediately sensing his father's agitation. "What is it, father? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have." Edward set the diary on the table. "This was your mother's. I found it in the attic. She wrote something important in it, something about your grandfather and great-grandfather." He read the relevant passages aloud, while Thomas and Mrs. Dawson listened. When he finished, Mrs. Dawson's weathered face had gone thoughtful. "I remember your father spending time in the East Wing," she said slowly. "This was before you were born, when I first came to work here. Your grandfather was still alive then. The old master had his study there, spent hours behind closed doors. No one was allowed in without express invitation. After he died, your father continued the practice, though not as strictly. Do you remember anything specific about the East Wing? Any rooms that seemed particularly important?" Mrs. Dawson shook her head. "It's been closed off for so long now, and my memory isn't what it was. But I do recall your grandfather having the entire wing remodeled back in the 1850s, brought in workmen from London, which seemed odd at the time. Local craftsmen were perfectly capable. Why London workmen?" Thomas asked. "Privacy, perhaps," Edward mused. "If you wanted to build something secret, you would not use local workers who might talk." He stood, decision made. "We need to search the East Wing, thoroughly." "Mr. Edward, that wing is dangerous," Mrs. Dawson protested. "The floor is rotted through in places. The ceiling collapsed 2 years ago. I'll be careful." "Thomas, you'll stay here." "No," Thomas's voice was firm. "Mother left those clues. She meant for both of us to find whatever's there." "I'm going with you." Edward started to argue, but saw the determination in his son's eyes. The boy was right. If there was something to find, they should find it together. "Very well, but you follow my instructions exactly. If I say a floor is unsafe, you do not step on it. Agreed?" Agreed. They prepared carefully, gathering lanterns, rope, and sturdy walking sticks to test questionable flooring. Mrs. Dawson watched with obvious anxiety as they set off into the abandoned wing. The corridor stretched before them, dark and damp, wallpaper peeling in long strips. Edward led the way, testing each board before committing his weight to it. The East Wing had 20 rooms, most of them shut up and empty. They moved systematically room by room. The first few held nothing but dust and decay, furniture covered in sheets, windows that no longer shut properly against the weather. In what had been his grandfather's bedroom, Edward paused. The room was largely bare, but a massive mahogany wardrobe still stood against one wall, too heavy to move easily. "Help me with this," Edward said. Together they managed to shift it aside. Behind, the wallpaper was intact, showing no sign of a hidden door or panel. Disappointed, they moved on. His grandfather's study was next. The room was larger, with floor-to-ceiling bookcases built into the walls. Most of the books were gone, sold years ago, but the shelves remained. Edward examined them closely, tapping on the wood, looking for hollow spaces or hidden compartments. Nothing. Thomas wandered to the windows, looking out over what had been formal gardens. "Father, look at this," Edward joined him. From this angle, they could see the entire estate layout, the geometric patterns of pathways and flower beds, now overgrown. "What am I looking at?" "At the design. See how the paths form a pattern?" Thomas traced it in the air. "It's like the puzzle box grandfather gave me for my birthday. Mother said it came from your father. Remember? You had to press specific sections in the right order to open it." Edward stared at his son, then back at the garden. The boy was right. The layout was too deliberate, too precise to be merely decorative. It was a pattern, a code perhaps. But what did it mean? "You think the garden pattern corresponds to something in the house?" Edward asked, studying the overgrown pathways more carefully. "Maybe. Grandfather always said that everything meaningful has a pattern. You just have to learn to see it." They returned to examining the study, this time looking for connections to the garden layout. Edward traced the bookcases with his fingers, counting the sections, noting their positions. There were 12 sections in total, arranged in a specific pattern around the room. Like the garden pathways, it seemed deliberate. "The garden has 12 main paths radiating from the center fountain," Thomas said. "The bookcases have 12 sections, but which section corresponds to which path?" Edward puzzled over the problem, then remembered something. His grandfather's desk, long since sold, had faced the window overlooking the gardens. He had sat there for hours, able to see the entire layout. "Stand where the desk would have been. Look at the gardens. Which path is most prominent from that angle?" Thomas positioned himself carefully. "The one leading east, toward the sunrise, east, the east wing." Edward moved to the easternmost bookcase section and began examining it more carefully. Unlike the others, this section had a decorative panel at its base, carved with what appeared to be simple flourishes. But on closer inspection, the flourishes formed a pattern, a sequence of curves and angles. Thomas, the puzzle box. "How did you open it?" "Press the corners in order following the carved lines." Edward studied the panel, identifying 5 distinct pressure points following the carved pattern. He pressed them in sequence, holding his breath. Nothing happened. He tried again, varying the pressure and timing. Still nothing. "Perhaps it needs all the sections pressed," Thomas suggested. Like a combination. They spent the next hour examining each bookcase section, finding similar panels in 3 other locations. Each had a different carved pattern, each suggested a different sequence. But which order? And how many needed to be activated? Frustration mounted as afternoon turned to evening. Mrs. Dawson called them back for supper, which they ate in distracted silence. Edward's mind would not rest, turning the puzzle over and over. His grandfather had been clever, that much was certain. But surely he had left some way for family members to solve this mystery. After supper, Edward returned to Margaret's diary, reading more carefully this time. Thomas sat beside him, reading over his shoulder. Most entries were personal reflections, but occasionally Margaret mentioned conversations with Edward's father, observations about family habits. One entry from 1878 caught Edward's attention. "Today is the anniversary of old Mr. Thornhill's death. Edward's father always becomes melancholy on this date. He spent the morning in the East Wing, as he does every year on the 23rd of March. He said he was paying respects in his own way. I wonder if his father is buried there, though Edward assures me the family plot is in the churchyard. The 23rd of March, the date his grandfather had died." Edward grabbed the calendar from the wall. Today was the 15th of October, but the date might be significant nonetheless. "Thomas, fetch me paper and pencil." He wrote out the date, 23rd of March, 1855. Then he converted it to numbers, 2, 3, 3, 1, 8, 5, 5, 7 digits. He had found panels in 4 bookcase sections. What if the pattern required pressing them multiple times, following a numerical sequence? They returned to the East Wing with renewed purpose. the lantern light casting strange shadows on the damaged walls. Edward positioned himself at the first panel, the one in the easternmost section. Following the date sequence, he pressed 2 times, pause, 3 times, pause. 3 times, pause. He moved to the second panel, continuing the sequence, 1 time, 8 times, 5 times. To the third panel, 5 times. He had pressed all 7 digits across the 4 panels. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then deep within the wall, they heard a click, the sound of a mechanism engaging. A section of the eastern bookcase swung inward, revealing a narrow opening behind it. Cool air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of stone and earth. Edward and Thomas stared at each other in amazement. Then Edward lifted his lantern and peered into the darkness beyond. "Stay close to me," he said quietly. "Whatever we find, we face it together." Thomas nodded, his young face solemn in the lamplight. Edward took his son's hand, and together they stepped through the opening into the unknown. The passage was narrow, the walls roughly hewn from stone. Edward tested each step before committing his weight, acutely aware that Thomas depended on his caution. The air grew cooler as they descended, a damp chill that spoke of deep earth and long years of isolation. The lantern light danced across the walls, revealing tool marks where someone had carved this passage by hand. "This must have taken months," Edward murmured. "Perhaps years. Why would grandfather do this?" Thomas's voice echoed slightly in the confined space. "I intend to find out." They descended for what felt like 20 feet, the stairs turning twice before leveling out. The passage continued forward, and Edward noticed the construction changed. Here the walls were lined with brick, the work more professional. This was no hasty hiding place, but a deliberately engineered structure. After 30 paces, they reached a door. It was simple but sturdy, set in an iron frame. A lock mechanism showed in the lamplight, but it was unlike any lock Edward had seen. Instead of a keyhole, it had 6 numbered dials, each showing digits from 0 to 9. "A combination lock," Edward said, examining it closely. 6 numbers needed to open it? "Try the date again," Thomas suggested. Edward set the dials to 233185, the first 6 digits of his grandfather's death date. He tried the handle. Nothing. He tried reversing the order. Still locked. They were missing something, some additional piece of information. He thought back through everything they had learned. Margaret's diary entries, his father's cryptic words, the garden layout, the puzzle box. What connected them all? What would his grandfather have used as a combination? Something meaningful that family members would know, but outsiders would not. "The family crest," Thomas said suddenly. "Remember, Mother used to make you tell me the history. 3 stars above a hill with thorn bushes." 3 stars, Edward repeated slowly. 3 thornhills? He set the dials 333111, 333111. He tried the handle, and this time it turned with a satisfying click. The door swung open, revealing a small room beyond. Edward held the lantern high, illuminating a space perhaps 12 feet square. Stone shelves lined 3 walls, and on those shelves lay objects wrapped in oilcloth and tied with careful precision. They stepped inside, and Edward's hands shook as he lifted the first package. It was heavy, substantial. He set it on the stone floor and carefully unwrapped it. Inside, gleaming in the lantern light, were gold sovereigns, hundreds of them, stacked in neat rows. "Father," Thomas breathed. "Is that real gold?" Edward picked up a coin, turned it in the light. It was genuine, stamped with Queen Victoria's profile. He checked the dates. 1850, 1851, 1852, coins from the early years of his grandfather's wealth. He looked at the other packages on the shelves, counted quickly. At least 20 more bundles of similar size. With trembling fingers, he opened another package. More gold, and beneath it, documents wrapped in additional oilcloth. Edward unfolded them carefully, scanning the handwriting. Business certificates, bonds, stock holdings in various companies. All legitimate, all documented, all in his grandfather's name. A third package held a sealed letter addressed to the heir of Thornhill Manor, to be opened only in circumstances of dire necessity. Edward broke the seal with unsteady hands and read by lamplight. If you are reading this, the family has fallen on evil times. I write this in 1854 in the hope that it will never be needed. But experience has taught me that fortunes can vanish as quickly as morning mist. I survived the banking crisis of 1825 by refusing to trust banks with everything I owned. This room contains insurance against catastrophe, wealth held aside for the darkest days. The letter went on, explaining the quantities stored, the nature of the investments, instructions for converting the bonds to cash through specific London banking houses that would not ask uncomfortable questions. Edward's grandfather had thought of everything, planned for every eventuality. But why keep it secret? Thomas asked. Why not just tell his son? To protect us, Edward realized. If my father had known, if I had known, we might have been tempted to use it for lesser emergencies. It was meant only for true disaster, for when all else was lost. He looked at the packages surrounding them, calculating quickly in his mind. There must be at least $4 million worth here, perhaps more. They stood in silence, the weight of discovery settling over them. They were not ruined after all. They were wealthy beyond imagining. Edward and Thomas remained in the vault for nearly an hour, methodically examining each package. The reality of their discovery seemed impossible, a dream from which they might wake at any moment. But the gold remained solid in Edward's hands, the documents crisp and real beneath his fingers. This was not illusion or desperate fantasy. This was salvation. We must be careful, Edward said finally. If we reveal this suddenly, people will ask questions. Where did the money come from? Why hidden? Some might even accuse us of theft. But grandfather's letter explains everything, Thomas protested. To us, yes. But to the world, we are desperate men who conveniently discovered a fortune just as the auction loomed. We need to be strategic, to document everything properly, to establish the legitimacy of this wealth before we announce it. Edward continued examining the documents, and as he did, a particular sheaf of papers caught his attention. These were older than the others, yellowed with age, covered in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Contracts, Edward realized, business agreements from decades past. And one name appeared repeatedly, Blackwood. James Blackwood, Lord Richard Blackwood's grandfather. Edward's hands steadied as he read. The first document was a loan agreement dated March 1825, during the banking crisis that had ruined so many. James Blackwood had borrowed an enormous sum from Edward's grandfather, £15,000, to be repaid with interest over 20 years. The interest rate was generous, the terms favorable. His grandfather had essentially saved the Blackwood estate from ruin, but there was no record of repayment. No cancelled note, no receipt. Only the original contract with its wax seals and signatures, witnessed and notarized. Edward flipped through more documents, finding additional loans, each carefully documented, each unpaid. By 1835, James Blackwood owed over £30,000. Then Edward found the witness statement. His grandfather had written it in careful legal language. Dated August 1826. It detailed how James Blackwood had used insider knowledge of the banking crisis to profit while others suffered. How he had deliberately spread false rumors to drive down property values so he could acquire land cheaply. The statement named witnesses, cited specific instances, provided dates and locations. What is it, Father? Thomas asked, seeing Edward's expression change. Evidence, Edward said slowly. Evidence that the Blackwood fortune was built on fraud and deception. Evidence that their grandfather owed mine a debt he never repaid. He continued reading, finding more documents. Letters from James Blackwood pleading for more time, making excuses, promising payment that never came. And finally, a letter from Edward's grandfather to his son, explaining why he had never collected the debt. I could destroy them, the letter read. But James Blackwood has a family, including a young son who bears no guilt for his father's sins. I have chosen to keep this knowledge private, to be used only if the Blackwood family should ever threaten ours. Let this be insurance, not revenge. Use it wisely if the need ever arises. Edward sat back against the stone wall, his mind reeling. His grandfather had been protecting them even beyond the grave, providing not just financial resources, but leverage against the very family now trying to take their home. Lord Richard Blackwood's eagerness to acquire the property suddenly made terrible sense. Had he somehow known about the evidence? Or did he simply recognize the property's true value and see an opportunity to profit from Edward's misfortune? Thomas, we need to be very careful about what we do next. Edward gathered the most important documents, wrapping them carefully. These papers change everything. They prove we have the means to fight back and the leverage to protect ourselves. But revealing them will cause enormous scandal. Will we use them? Thomas asked quietly. I don't know yet. I need to think, to plan. Edward checked his pocket watch. They had been underground for hours. Mrs. Dawson would be worried. We should go back up. We'll lock everything away, and tomorrow I'll consult Mr. Pettigrew. They made their way back through the passage, emerging into the East Wing study as twilight faded outside. The bookcase panel swung closed behind them with a soft click. Edward carefully reset the combination, committing it to memory. Whatever happened next, they needed to keep this discovery absolutely secret until they were ready to reveal it on their own terms. Mrs. Dawson met them at the kitchen door, relief evident on her weathered face. I was about to come searching for you. Are you all right? We're fine, Edward assured her. Better than fine, actually. We found something important in the East Wing. I need you to keep absolute confidence about what I'm about to tell you. He explained what they had discovered, watching her face transform from concern to astonishment to cautious joy. When he mentioned the Blackwood documents, her expression hardened. That family, she said quietly. My father lost everything in 1825. He owned a small shipping company, had contracts with 3 banks. When the crisis hit, James Blackwood spread rumors that my father's ships were unseaworthy, that he couldn't fulfill his obligations. The banks called in their loans. Father tried to fight it, but Blackwood had connections, influence. Within 6 months, we lost everything. I'm sorry, Edward said. I didn't know. Few people do. It was a long time ago, and we weren't the only ones Blackwood ruined. But I remember my father's face when he realized we would lose our home. I remember my mother crying in the kitchen. I was 14 years old, and overnight we went from comfortable to destitute. She looked at Edward with fierce determination. If those documents can bring justice, even this late, you must use them. Edward nodded slowly. The weight of this discovery was becoming clearer. This was not just about saving. 6 months passed, like a dream from which Edward feared to wake. Early spring arrived with promise, bringing new life to Thornhill Manor after its long winter of despair. The essential repairs were complete, the dangerous sections of the East Wing secured, the roof patched against the weather. Edward had been careful not to restore the manor to ostentatious glory. Instead, he focused on dignity and function, on making it a home again, rather than a monument to faded grandeur. Thomas, now 12, had grown taller and more confident. He attended school regularly, had rekindled friendships with William Peterson and Sarah Fletcher, and showed a natural talent for mathematics that reminded Edward of his own father. The boy still carried the quiet maturity that poverty had taught him, but now it was tempered with genuine joy. Miss Emily Hartley visited often, her presence bringing warmth to rooms that had been cold too long. She and Edward had developed an understanding, a courtship conducted with proper restraint but genuine affection. She never tried to replace Margaret in his heart or Thomas's memory. Instead, she offered something different, a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. Edward found himself looking forward to her visits, to the sound of her laughter in the kitchen, to the way she challenged his thinking during their conversations. Mrs. Dawson remained, of course now properly paid and restored to her position with dignity. The investigation into the Blackwood fraud had vindicated her late father's name. A justice that came decades too late, but meant everything to her. She considered Edward and Thomas her family now, and the feeling was mutual. The village had adjusted to the dramatic reversal of fortune. Some of Edward's former friends had attempted to reconcile, offering apologies that ranged from genuine to self-serving. Edward accepted them all with grace, but did not forget who had stood by him in the darkest days. Mr. Pettigrew had been promoted within his firm, his reputation enhanced by his role in the case. Sir Edmund Grey became a regular visitor, his friendship with Edward's father renewed through the son. Lord Richard Blackwood had been disgraced. The investigation revealing ongoing financial improprieties beyond his grandfather's original fraud. Much of the Blackwood wealth had been seized, their social standing destroyed. Edward felt no triumph in this, only a quiet sadness at the waste of it all. With a portion of the fortune, Edward established an educational trust for village children, ensuring that poverty would not prevent any child from receiving proper schooling. He opened the Manor's restored library to the community, making knowledge accessible to all. His grandfather's wealth, accumulated in silence and secrecy, now served the greater good. On a Sunday evening in April, the family gathered for dinner. Edward, Thomas, Mrs. Dawson, and Miss Hartley sat around the kitchen table they all preferred to the formal dining room. The conversation was easy, filled with plans for the future and reflections on the journey that had brought them here. "Father," Thomas asked during a lull in conversation, "what will you tell your grandchildren about all this?" Edward considered the question carefully as he considered all matters of importance. That when you lose everything, you discover what truly matters. We lost our fortune and found our character. We faced ruin and discovered we were richer than we knew, not in gold, but in integrity and in each other. Thomas nodded, satisfied. Miss Hartley reached across the table and gently touched Edward's hand, a gesture of understanding and agreement. That night, Edward stood before the restored family portrait in the entrance hall. Professional cleaners had removed the water damage, and the painting now hung straight and proud once more. His grandfather gazed out from the canvas with those penetrating eyes, and Edward thought he detected the hint of a smile in that painted face. "Thank you," Edward whispered, "for your foresight, for your planning, for understanding that some treasures are worth hiding until they're truly needed." He turned from the portrait and climbed the stairs to his room, passing Thomas's door where his son slept peacefully. The manor settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs, no longer sounds of decay, but of a home lived in and loved. Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle and renewing, washing away the last traces of the difficult winter. Edward Thornhill had learned that fortunes could be lost and found, that family legacies were measured in values, not valuables, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came wrapped in hardship. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, for the first time in years, he slept without worry, secure in the knowledge that they had endured, and in enduring had discovered who they truly were.